The return. At 6:12 on a cold Saturday morning, Mason Carter turned onto a dirt road he had not driven in almost 11 years. He expected to see 40 acres of quiet farmland, the old red barn, and the line of oak trees his father had planted when Mason was a boy. Instead, headlights from construction trucks filled the horizon. A bulldozer was pushing earth across the exact field where Mason had once learned to ride a bicycle. A giant sign stood beside the road. Cedar Ridge Estates. Mason slowed his truck, staring in disbelief. There were concrete foundations everywhere. Roads had already been carved into his land. On the hill, workers were framing houses. Mason whispered, "Oh, who gave you permission to build here?" He had no idea that the answer would change everything. The sign. Mason parked beside the construction entrance and walked toward the sign. The closer he got, the more houses he could see. Not 3, not 10. Dozens. A development map showed 72 planned homes spread across his 40 acres. Mason pulled the deed from his glove box. His father's name was still on the original document, followed by Mason's name from the inheritance transfer. The land was his, every acre. He approached a security guard. "Who owns this property?" The guard pointed toward the development office, followed by Cedar Ridge. "HOA," he answered. Mason almost laughed. "Oh, there is no Cedar Ridge HOA on my deed." "Oh, Horst," the guard shrugged. "Oh, the project has been approved for years." Mason looked back at the bulldozers. "Oh, not by me." Oh, the woman in pink, a black SUV, rolled across the unfinished road and stopped beside Mason. A woman in an immaculate pink jacket stepped out. Victoria Hale, president of the Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association, looked at Mason as though he were an employee who had arrived late. "Oh, you need to leave the construction zone." "Oh," she said. Mason held up his deed. "Oh, you need to stop construction on my property." Victoria's smile disappeared. "Oh, your property?" Mason nodded. 40 acres. Recorded deed. My father's land. Victoria folded her arms. "Well, that land was incorporated into Cedar Ridge years ago." Mason asked, "Oh, show me where I signed." Victoria replied, "Oh, you don't understand how planned communities work." Mason stared at the half-built houses. "Well, I understand property law, and I understand trespassing." Victoria stepped closer. "Oh, be careful, Mr. Carter. You have no idea who you're challenging." The first bulldozer. Victoria walked away and told a foreman to continue. Mason watched a bulldozer roll toward the old barn. He ran after it, shouting for the operator to stop. The machine slowed, but Victoria yelled, "Oh, keep working!" Mason turned in disbelief. "Oh, that's my father's barn!" "Tom," Victoria answered. "Oh, it's an unsafe structure scheduled for removal." Mason pointed toward the building. "Oh, me father built that by hand," Victoria shrugged. "The development plan doesn't preserve old structures." Mason's anger finally broke through. "You don't get to erase my family's history because your subdivision needs a better view." Workers stopped and looked between them. Victoria pulled out her phone. It's security. Escort him off the site." Mason stood still. "Oh, call whoever you want. I'm not leaving until I know how 72 houses appeared on land I never sold." The deed. Mason returned to his truck and spread the deed across the hood. His father, Robert Carter, had purchased the property 38 years earlier. The legal description matched the county map exactly. 40 acres. No subdivision. No HOA. No development easement, granting Cedar Ridge ownership. Mason photographed every page. Then he noticed something strange. Attached to the deed was an old survey showing a narrow access road crossing the property. It was marked as a utility easement, only 12 feet wide. The new development road was nearly 30 feet wide. Someone had turned a small access easement into a major entrance road. Mason called his attorney, Daniel Brooks. "Daniel, I think someone built a subdivision on my land." There was a long silence. Then Daniel said, "Oh, send me the deed, and don't sign anything." The old barn before leaving, Mason walked to the barn. Construction fencing surrounded it. The red paint was faded, but the initials RC were still carved above the door. Mason remembered his father lifting him onto a horse there. He remembered winter mornings, family dinners, and his mother's voice calling them home. A bulldozer waited 20 yards away. Mason touched the barn door and whispered, "I'm sorry I stayed away so long." His phone rang. It was his sister Claire. Mason told her what he had found. She went silent. Then she said something that chilled him. "Oh, Dad warned me about Victoria." Mason turned. "What did he say?" Claire replied, "He said, if anyone ever tried to develop that land, we should look in the old farmhouse attic." Mason stared at the farmhouse. Suddenly, the land held a secret his father had never told him. The attic Mason drove to the farmhouse and forced open the swollen front door. Dust covered the floors. Family photographs hung crookedly on the walls. Upstairs, he climbed into the attic and found an old metal trunk. Inside were survey maps, tax receipts, handwritten letters, and a locked wooden box. One envelope had his name on it. "For Mason, if Cedar Ridge ever comes." His hands shook as he opened it. His father's letter explained that years earlier, developers had approached him about buying the property. Robert refused. Then he discovered that a local planning group was attempting to create an access agreement without his permission. Robert had fought it. He wrote, "If they ever tell you this land became part of their community, do not believe them. Find the original county plat." Mason read the final line twice. "The proof is hidden where the old survey begins." The survey Mason called Daniel Brooks again. Daniel told him to photograph the original survey and bring every document to his office. Mason spread the papers across the farmhouse kitchen table. One map showed the 40 acres surrounded by neighboring parcels. Another showed a proposed Cedar Ridge boundary. The dates were years apart. The boundary appeared to swallow Mason's land, but there was no signature from Robert Carter. Daniel studied the map through a video call. "Oh, this isn't an annexation document," he said. "It's a proposed plan." Mason asked, "Then how did they build?" Daniel replied, "That's what we're going to find out." Mason looked through the window. A crane was lifting roof trusses over another house. The sight made his blood boil. Someone had turned a proposal into apparent ownership. But one question remained. Who changed the records? The HOA office. Victoria called Mason that afternoon and ordered him to attend a meeting at the Cedar Ridge clubhouse. Mason arrived with Daniel. Victoria sat behind a long table surrounded by board members. A development manager placed a thick binder in front of Mason. "These are the Cedar Ridge governing documents," Victoria said. Mason opened the binder. Inside were maps, rules, and an alleged transfer agreement. The document claimed Robert Carter had agreed to place his land under the Cedar Ridge Association. Mason pointed at the signature. "That's not my father's signature," Victoria said. It was verified. Daniel leaned forward. "Be whom?" The manager avoided his eyes. Mason looked closer. The date on the document was 3 years after Robert's death. He slowly raised his head. "My father couldn't have signed this. He was already dead." The room went silent. The dead man's signature. Victoria tried to recover. "There may be an administrative error." Daniel took a photograph of the document. An administrative error doesn't create a property transfer. Mason asked for the original. Victoria refused. The HOA's attorney has it. Daniel replied. Then we need the county recording number. Nobody answered. Mason pushed back his chair. You built 72 houses using a document that appears to have been signed after my father died. Victoria stood. You are making accusations you cannot prove. Mason looked directly at her. Then let me prove them. He walked out. Outside, a crane swung over the field where his father's orchard once stood. Mason called the county recorder. Why need every document associated with parcel 42? The clerk searched the system and then said, Mr. Carter, there is something you should see in person. The county archive. The county archive was an old stone building downtown. Mason and Daniel arrived just before closing. The clerk brought out a box containing historical property records. The original plat was there. Mason unfolded it carefully. His 40 acres were clearly marked as parcel 42. There was no Cedar Ridge boundary, no HOA, no subdivision. Then the clerk produced a later map. Parcel 42 had been shaded as part of the development. Mason asked, who requested this change? The clerk pointed to a recording number. Daniel wrote it down. We need the supporting document. The clerk returned with another file. Inside was the alleged transfer agreement. But something was wrong. The notary stamp belonged to a notary who had retired 2 years before the document date. Daniel stared at the page. This is getting much worse. Mason felt anger replaced by something colder. Someone had built a paper trail.
The notary. Daniel contacted the retired notary, Samuel Price. Samuel was 81 and walked with a cane, but his memory was sharp. When Mason showed him the document, Samuel immediately shook his head. Oh, I never notarized this. Oh's, he pointed to the stamp. Oh, that seal number was retired before this date. Oh. He then looked at the signature. Oh, I never saw Robert Carter sign anything like this. Samuel pulled an old ledger from a cabinet. Every genuine notarization had been recorded by date. The alleged transfer wasn't there. Samuel said, "Oh, wow, someone copied my old seal." Mason thanked him. As they left, Samuel called after them. "Oh, your father came to me years ago. He said if anyone ever tried to take that land, he had a second record." Mason stopped. "Oh, where?" "Oh," Samuel answered. "Oh, he said the answer was under the orchard. Oh, 13 the orchard." At sunset, Mason returned to the property. The old orchard was mostly gone. Construction had cleared nearly every tree. One ancient oak remained near the northern fence. Mason remembered his father calling it the guardian tree. He walked beneath it and searched the ground. A metal survey marker sat half buried near the roots. He dug carefully. Beneath the marker was a weatherproof metal tube. Inside was a rolled map and a small cassette tape. Mason stared at the tape. His father had recorded something. There was also a note, "Woo, play this before you trust anyone." Mason drove home and found an old cassette player in a storage box. He pressed play. His father's voice filled the room. "Oh, well, Mason, if you're hearing this, they probably succeeded in making people believe the land belongs to them." Mason closed his eyes. Robert continued, "Oh, the document they show you is not the real agreement." How? 14. Robert's recording. Robert's recording continued. He explained that years earlier, a developer named Harold Vance had tried to purchase the land. Robert refused. Harold then partnered with people connected to the local planning committee. Robert discovered they were preparing a false transfer document. He had copies of the original paperwork hidden separately. The land was never transferred, Robert said. But they may try to use the old access easement to make it appear that it was. Mason listened without moving. Then Robert said something unexpected. If Victoria Hale is still involved, do not confront her alone." Mason's face hardened. Victoria had been in the HOA for decades. His father had known her. Robert's final words were emotional. "This land is more than dirt. Your mother wanted you to have a place where your children could grow up. The tape clicked off. Mason sat in silence. Then his phone rang. Victoria was calling. 15, the warning, Mason answered. Victoria's voice was unusually calm. You found something, didn't you? Oh, Mason said nothing. She continued, your father was obsessed with old paperwork. Don't let his paranoia destroy your future. Oh, Mason asked. How do you know what I found? Victoria paused. Because I knew Robert, Mason replied. Then you know this land was never yours. Victoria's tone changed. If you keep interfering, the HOA will file a lawsuit against you for disrupting a lawful development. Mason laughed bitterly. You built houses on my land and you're threatening me for stopping you? Victoria said, 72 families have contracts. Mason looked through the window at the construction lights. Then maybe those families deserve to know who sold them homes. Victoria hung up. Mason turned to Daniel. We're not just stopping construction. We're finding out who created this entire scheme. HOA. 16. The families. The next morning, Mason drove through the development. Some houses were nearly finished. Families had already placed furniture inside. Children rode bicycles along unfinished sidewalks. Mason felt conflicted. These people had not stolen his land. They had been sold a story. He spoke to a young couple named Eric and Jenna. They had paid a deposit on a house overlooking the field. Mason showed them the deed. Jenna's face went pale. Are you saying this isn't the developer's land? Mason said. I'm saying the county records are being investigated. Eric looked toward the construction office. They told us everything was approved, Mason answered. I believe you. He didn't want innocent families to become enemies. Before leaving, Jenna said, if you're telling the truth, we'll help you. Mason realized something important. If the HOA had lied to buyers, the truth would eventually spread. 17, the contractor. Mason approached the construction office and asked for the project manager. A nervous man named Luis Ortega came outside. Mason showed him the county documents. Luis looked uncomfortable. I don't choose where we build, he said. Mason asked who gave him the site plans. Luis pointed toward the development company. Fuvance Developmento. Mason recognized the name from his father's recording. Luis admitted something else. The first survey we received showed this parcel as private land. Mason stared at him. Then why did you build here? Luis said. A revised survey arrived 2 months later. Daniel asked. Who approved the revision? Luis handed them a copy. The approval signature belonged to a county planning official who had retired years earlier. Mason looked at Daniel. Another forged trail. But now they had a witness who had seen the original survey.
The first demolition that afternoon, Mason received an alert from a neighbor. The bulldozers were moving toward the old barn. Mason raced back. Victoria stood near the fence watching. Mason shouted, "Stop the machine!" Victoria answered, "The barn has been condemned." Mason demanded to see the condemnation order. She held up a clipboard. Daniel arrived moments later and examined it. The document had no county seal. "This isn't a government order," he said. Victoria said, "It doesn't need to be." Mason stepped between the bulldozer and the barn. "You're not touching it." The operator shut down the engine. Victoria called security, but this time several homeowners came out and stood behind Mason. Jenna was there. Eric was there. Even Luis, the contractor, stood nearby. Victoria looked around and realized the situation was changing. 19. The town hall. Mason requested a public meeting at the town hall. The room filled quickly. Homeowners wanted answers. Farmers from neighboring properties came too. Daniel presented the original deed, the county plat, the suspicious transfer document, and the notary ledger. Victoria's attorney argued that the development had relied on recorded documents. Daniel replied, "Were recorded does not mean legitimate." Then Mason played Robert's recording. The room became completely silent. Robert's voice explained the attempted land transfer years earlier. Several homeowners looked at Victoria. One man asked, "Did you know about this?" Victoria refused to answer. Another homeowner asked why the HOA had never shown them the original parcel history. Victoria said, This is a legal matter. Oh, Mason stood. Oh, exactly. So let's let the law decide. The county announced that an emergency investigation would begin. 20. The county investigator, Rachel Morgan, arrived the next morning. She was direct and unemotional. She requested every document connected to Cedar Ridge. Victoria tried to limit access, but Rachel produced a formal records request. For 2 days, investigators compared signatures, dates, maps, and recording numbers. Then Rachel found a pattern. Every document that placed Mason's land inside Cedar Ridge had been created within a narrow 6-month period. Every supporting signature had inconsistencies. Several witnesses had never actually signed the papers. Rachel told Mason, someone manufactured a chain of authority. Jaros, Mason asked, can we stop construction? Rachel replied, I can recommend an emergency halt, but a judge may need to issue the final order. Mason looked toward the development. 72 houses stood there. How long? Rachel answered, if we have enough evidence. Very soon. 21 Nervisecker, the missing file. Rachel discovered one crucial file was missing from the county archive. It contained the original planning commission vote that supposedly approved Cedar Ridge's expansion. Without it, the developers claimed the approval had been valid. Mason and Daniel searched old newspaper archives and found a tiny article from 15 years earlier. It reported that the Planning Commission meeting had been canceled because of a storm. Yet the HOA's document said the expansion was approved that exact evening. Daniel stared at the article. They couldn't have voted if the meeting never happened. Rachel agreed. Now we need the meeting records. A retired county employee remembered that old records had been transferred to a storage facility. Mason followed the lead. In a dusty box, they found the missing minutes. The page for that meeting was blank. No vote, no approval, no expansion. 22. The photo. Inside the storage box was an old photograph from the same year. It showed the Planning Commission building during the storm. The doors were closed. A handwritten note on the back read, "A meeting canceled at 4:30 p.m." Mason felt the pieces locked together. Someone had created a fictional approval date and used it to justify the development boundary. But there was still one question. Who? Rachel asked for the names of everyone who submitted documents during that period. One name appeared repeatedly. Harold Vance, the developer. Another appeared beside him on several submissions. Victoria Hale. Mason stared at the list. His father's warning suddenly made sense. This had not started recently. It had been planned for years. 23. The developer, Harold Vance, was now in his 70s and living in another state. Rachel contacted him. At first, he refused to speak. Then she mentioned the forged documents. He requested a lawyer. 2 days later, his attorney sent a statement claiming Harold had relied on professional consultants. But one sentence stood out. The statement said Robert Carter had, verbally agreed to the development years ago. Mason knew that was impossible. His father never agreed to sell. Daniel asked Rachel if verbal permission could transfer land. "I will know," she said. "I will not ownership." Mason wanted to confront saying the bank records. A subpoena uncovered old bank records. Payments from Vance Development had gone to a consulting company that claimed to provide community planning services, but the company had no employees, no office, and almost no business activity beyond Cedar Ridge. Daniel explained that this could establish motive. Rachel requested additional records. Meanwhile, Victoria called another emergency HOA meeting. She told homeowners that Mason was trying to destroy their community. "He wants to take your homes away," she said. Mason watched the meeting from outside. He wanted to shout back, but he didn't. He knew the truth would be stronger than anger. Jenna stood up inside and asked Victoria, "Why did you never tell us the land was disputed?" Victoria had no answer. Other homeowners began asking questions. The room that once belonged to Victoria was becoming hostile to her. 25. The child's question. Outside the clubhouse, Mason met a little boy whose family had bought one of the houses. The boy held a toy bulldozer. He asked Mason, "Are they going to tear down my house?" Mason crouched beside him. "I don't know what will happen yet." The boy looked scared. "My mom says we might have to move." Mason felt a heavy guilt, even though he had done nothing wrong. He promised, Well, I'm going to do everything I can to make sure your family gets treated fairly. The child nodded. That moment changed Mason's approach. He wasn't fighting 72 families. He was fighting the people who had deceived them. He told Daniel, "Oh, I don't want revenge. I want the truth, and I want these families protected." Daniel smiled. "Oh, that's exactly why your father would have trusted you with this land." 26. The court order. 3 days later, Rachel called. A judge had issued an emergency construction halt. No new foundations, no demolitions, and no property transfers. The bulldozers stopped. Cranes froze. Workers stood idle. Mason drove to the property and watched the site fall silent. For the first time in months, the land sounded like itself again. Wind moved through the remaining trees. Birds returned to the field. Mason walked to the old barn and touched the weathered wood. But the court order was temporary. The real battle was coming. The judge would need to decide whether the development documents were valid. Daniel warned Mason that the developers would fight hard. Mason answered, let them. He had something they didn't have. The original deed, county evidence, the notary, the contractor, and 72 homeowners demanding answers. 27. The deposition. The legal depositions began. Victoria was questioned first. Daniel asked when she first learned about Robert Carter's land. She claimed she couldn't remember. He presented an old email showing she had discussed the parcel 15 years earlier. She said the email was taken out of context. Then he presented another. Then another. Finally, Victoria admitted she had known the land was disputed. Mason watched silently. Daniel asked, "Did you ever meet Robert Carter about transferring this property?" Victoria answered, "Oh, no." Daniel placed the alleged transfer agreement on the table. Then why does this document claim you witnessed the process? Victoria stopped speaking. Her attorney objected. The judge allowed the question. Victoria finally said, "I don't know." Mason knew that answer would matter. 28. The contractor speaks. Luis Ortega was questioned next. He explained that the original site plan showed Mason's land as private. He said the revised survey arrived later with instructions to proceed immediately. He identified the person who delivered it, planning consultant Paul Mercer. Daniel asked whether Luis had ever seen Paul meet Victoria. Luis said yes, several times. Then he revealed something more important. Before construction began, Paul told the contractors, "Don't worry, Carter won't be coming back." Mason's jaw tightened. They knew he was away. They had counted on him staying away. But they had underestimated one thing. Mason had returned. 29. The family letters. Mason returned to the farmhouse attic and searched deeper. Behind a loose wooden panel, he found a bundle of letters between his father and his mother. Robert had written about the land almost every year. He described plans to build a family home there someday. One letter said, "On this land will belong to Mason, but only if he remembers why we kept it." Mason's mother replied, "He'll understand when he has children." Mason sat on the attic floor, overwhelmed. He had spent 11 years away because he couldn't bear returning after his parents died. Now he understood why his father had fought so hard. The land wasn't an investment. It was a promise. Mason took the letters downstairs. Daniel read them and quietly said, "And this is the heart of the case." The secret cave. Behind the barn, Mason remembered a childhood game. His father had shown him a narrow stone opening beneath a hill and told him it was an old root cellar. Mason cleared the brush. Inside was a small underground room. There were shelves, rusted tools, and another metal box. The box contained original survey photographs and a second copy of the county plat. But there was also a ledger. Robert had recorded every meeting with developers, every threat, and every attempted purchase. One entry named Victoria directly. Asaru Victoria offered to help obtain control of parcel 42. Another entry said, "Joe refused." Mason closed the ledger. This was no longer circumstantial evidence. His father had documented the pressure in real time. 31. The threat. That evening, Mason received an anonymous text. "I'll walk away while you still can." He showed Daniel. The attorney immediately advised him to report it. Mason did. Then another message arrived. "Oh, you don't know what happened to your father." Mason froze. His father's death had been ruled natural. There had never been suspicion of anything else. Daniel told him not to speculate. or fear is useful to people who don't have evidence. Mason agreed. Instead of responding, he saved everything. The next morning, Rachel's office confirmed the number was linked to a disposable phone purchased near Cedar Ridge. The investigation was widening. Mason realized someone was becoming desperate. 32. The camera. A homeowner named Jenna gave Mason security footage from her house. The camera faced the construction entrance. On the night the anonymous message was sent, a black SUV had entered the site. The license plate was partially visible. Investigators traced it to a company vehicle registered to Paul Mercer. Rachel obtained records for the vehicle. Inside were copies of several documents connected to the disputed property. One folder was labeled Carter. Mason stared at the screen. Paul had been monitoring him. But the folder contained something unexpected. A photograph of Robert Carter from 15 years earlier, standing outside the county courthouse. On the back, someone had written, "Ah, knows." Mason whispered, "Ah, knew they were watching him." 33. The second signature, forensic analysts compared the signature on the alleged transfer agreement with Robert Carter's genuine signatures. The result was devastating for the developers. The signature had been traced from an old property document. It was a forgery, but investigators also found a second forged signature on an HOA authorization. This one belonged to a former board member who had died years earlier. 2 dead men, 2 fake signatures, 2 documents used to build Cedar Ridge. Rachel said, "Oh, we can now prove deliberate falsification." So Mason asked, "Is what happens to the houses?" Rachel answered, "That will be for the court." Mason looked toward the frozen development. He felt no satisfaction. 72 families were caught in someone else's crime. He knew the ending had to protect them too. 34. The homeowners unite. The homeowners formed their own committee. They stopped attending Victoria's meetings and began meeting at the community park. Jenna organized documents. Eric contacted other buyers. Families shared contracts and discovered identical promises about clear title. Mason attended their first meeting. He said, "I never wanted your homes. I wanted my land back and the truth exposed." A homeowner asked, "Would you let us stay if the court allows it?" Mason looked around. "If the law can create a solution that protects your families and restores my rights, I'll support it." That statement changed everything. The homeowners were no longer defending the HOA. They were demanding accountability from the developer. 35. The HOA recording. One homeowner brought an old recording from a private HOA meeting. It captured Victoria speaking years earlier about Ardo absorbing the Carter parcel. Haas. The recording was clear. Victoria said, "Once the houses are built, nobody will challenge it." Another person asked, "What if Carter returns?" Victoria laughed. "He won't." Mason listened twice. The words hurt more than he expected. His absence had been their strategy. They had assumed he would never return because grief had kept him away. Mason closed his eyes. Then he said, "They're going to learn why I came back." The recording became a central piece of evidence. Victoria's own voice had explained the plan. The final hearing. The final court hearing lasted hours. The developer's attorneys argued that the subdivision had relied on official records. Daniel responded with the original deed, county plat, canceled meeting records, notary ledger, forged signatures, contractor testimony, financial records, recordings, and Robert's hidden ledger, each piece connected to the next. Finally, the judge asked Victoria whether she disputed the authenticity of the evidence. Her attorney requested a recess. When court resumed, Victoria was no longer speaking. The judge issued a preliminary ruling that the land transfer documents were invalid and that Cedar Ridge had no ownership interest in parcel 42. Mason lowered his head. It was the first time in months he could breathe. 37. The verdict. The final ruling came 2 weeks later. The court confirmed that Robert Carter had never transferred the 40 acres. The forged documents were declared invalid. Construction on the remaining undeveloped land was permanently stopped. The development company was ordered to compensate affected homeowners through a separate settlement process. The HOA's disputed authority over Mason's property was removed. Mason walked outside the courthouse and looked at the sky. Daniel asked, "How does it feel?" Mason answered, "Like I can finally hear my father's voice without being angry." He wasn't celebrating the family's problems. He was relieved that the truth had survived. The land was legally his again, but Mason still had one decision left. What would he do with 40 acres surrounded by 72 families? 38. The choice. Mason returned to the property. The completed houses stood along roads that had been carved through his fields. He could have demanded that everything be removed. He had the right to fight for the land. But he looked at the families living there and remembered the little boy with the toy bulldozer. Mason called Daniel. "I want to make a proposal." Instead of destroying the neighborhood, Mason would sell selected portions under a new legal agreement, preserving the remaining acres as protected family land. Existing homeowners would receive fair terms through the settlement. The old barn would become a community center. The remaining orchard would be replanted. Daniel smiled. "Your father would approve." Mason answered, "I think Mom would too." 39. The barn saved. The old barn was restored rather than demolished. Mason and the homeowners repaired the doors, replaced the roof, and cleaned the wooden beams. Above the entrance, Mason installed a simple sign, "Carter Family Barn." The little boy who had asked about his house came with his parents and helped plant an apple tree. Mason knelt beside him. "Oh, this tree will take years to grow." The boy asked, "Will you still be here?" Mason smiled. "Oh, yes." For the first time, the land felt alive again. Construction was no longer the sound of bulldozers. It was the sound of hammers, laughter, and people rebuilding something together. 40. The HOA election. The Cedar Ridge HOA held a new election. Victoria was removed from the board. Homeowners chose an independent committee with transparent financial records and public meetings. Jenna became secretary. Eric helped with property documentation. The first rule they passed was simple. No HOA officer could claim authority over land it did not legally own. Mason attended the meeting but refused a board position. He said, "I don't want control over your neighborhood. I want everyone to understand their rights." The room applauded. The HOA that had once been used as a weapon was slowly becoming what it should have been, a system for cooperation. 41. Victoria's fall. Victoria faced legal consequences for document falsification and financial misconduct. Mason never attended the proceedings to celebrate her downfall. He didn't need revenge anymore. The truth had done what anger never could. One evening, he saw Victoria outside the courthouse. She looked smaller than she had on the day she ordered the bulldozer toward his barn. She said quietly, "Oh, your father never forgave me." Mason answered, he didn't have to." Victoria asked, "Do you hate me?" Mason thought for a moment. "Oh no, but I will never forget what you tried to do." Then he walked away. Some victories don't require shouting. Sometimes walking away is the final answer. The orchard returns. Spring arrived. Mason planted new apple trees where the old orchard had been destroyed. Families helped. Children carried buckets of water. The first tree was planted beneath the guardian oak. Mason placed a small stone beside it with his parents' names engraved. He stood there with Claire and Emma watching the sunset. Claire said, Dad would love this." Mason nodded. He wanted us to use the land, not just own it. The wind moved through the branches. For a moment, Mason could almost hear his father's laugh. The 40 acres were no longer silent. They were growing again. 43. The house on the hill. Mason eventually built a modest house on the highest part of the property. It overlooked the restored barn, the orchard, and the homes that had once been at the center of the dispute. He kept the design simple: wood, stone, wide windows, and a porch facing the sunset. On the wall inside, he framed the original deed. Beside it, he placed his father's letter. The two documents told the same story. Ownership was important, but responsibility mattered more. Mason didn't want a mansion. He wanted a place where future generations could understand what had happened and why their family chose truth over revenge. 44. The children years passed. The children of Cedar Ridge grew up playing near the old barn. The community garden expanded. The orchard produced its first apples. Mason hosted neighborhood gatherings every summer. Sometimes someone would ask about the old dispute. Mason always answered, a piece of paper can lie. A signature can be forged, but records, witnesses, and courage can bring the truth back. The little boy with the toy bulldozer grew into a teenager. One afternoon, he asked Mason, "Did you really stop 72 houses?" Mason laughed. "No, I stopped people from stealing the land. The houses were never the enemy." That distinction became part of the neighborhood's history. 45. The last letter. On the 10th anniversary of his return, Mason opened the old metal box again. He found one final letter he had never noticed. It was from his mother. She had written it shortly before her death. "Oh, so, Mason, if you ever come home, don't let grief make your decisions for you. Your father loved the land, but he loved you more. Protect what matters, but don't become hard in the process." Mason read it twice. He understood why the ending had to be different from the beginning. He could have won by destroying everything. Instead, he had protected the land while helping the innocent families trapped in the development. His mother had been right. Justice without humanity would have been another kind of loss. 46. The memorial. The community built a small memorial near the old barn. It honored the original Carter family farm and the families who had helped expose the fraud. Mason didn't want his name at the top. He wanted his parents' names there. Beneath them were simple words, "How truth protects what fear cannot." At the dedication, Mason spoke for less than 5 minutes. He thanked the homeowners, county investigators, Daniel, Samuel the notary, and the workers who told the truth. Then he looked at the barn. "How my father taught me that land is never just land. It carries memories. It carries responsibility. And if we are lucky, it carries hope." 47. The final confrontation. After the ceremony, Mason received one final call from Victoria's former attorney. There was an offer to buy the remaining acres for a huge amount of money. Mason listened. The offer was tempting. But he remembered the bulldozers, the forged documents, and his father's letter. He declined. "Why?" the attorney asked. Mason looked toward the orchard. "Because I know what this land is worth now." The attorney laughed. "You mean financially?" Mason smiled. "No, I mean to my family." He ended the call. The land had already been treated like a number once. Mason refused to let it happen again. The first harvest. The orchard's first full harvest came the following fall. Families filled baskets with apples. Children ran between the trees. The barn doors were open. Mason stood near the old oak with an apple in his hand. Claire joined him. "Ah, you know," she said. "Ah, you came back angry." Mason smiled. "I came back angry because I thought I had lost everything." Claire asked, "When now?" Mason looked at the homes, the barn, the orchard, and the people. "Now I realize I came back to find what was left." Claire hugged him. The 40 acres had survived. More importantly, the family had survived the attempt to erase its history.
The lesson. The Cedar Ridge story became a warning told in nearby communities. Homeowners learned to read deeds. They demanded transparent HOA records. County offices tightened verification procedures. Developers were required to provide clearer title documentation. But Mason's favorite part of the story was never the courtroom. It was the moment the bulldozers stopped. Silence returned to the land. That was when he understood the difference between winning and healing. Winning meant proving the property was his. Healing meant deciding what to do with it afterward. He chose both. He protected the land and built a community that no longer feared its own HOA. 50. The final sunset. 10 years after Mason's return, he stood on the porch of his house as the sun disappeared behind the trees. The old barn glowed orange. The orchard moved gently in the evening wind. Children were playing near the community garden. Mason held his father's original deed in one hand and his mother's letter in the other. He no longer needed either document to prove who he was. They were reminders, not weapons. He looked across the 40 acres and whispered, "We made it, Dad." The land was no longer surrounded by construction noise. It was filled with life. And the final lesson was simple. When someone tries to take what belongs to you, don't let anger make you reckless. Let the truth make you unstoppable.